Hi everyone, I'm Mr. Black from the channel MrBlacksAA. Myself and my son MrBlacksAA are taking over Unit 522's channel today. And there's nothing you can do about it, okay? So go subscribe to me or Unit dies, period. And if I find any comments in the comment section about how, "Ooh, it's not Unit 522's voice, I use this to sleep," then so help me God, I'll be hiding in your closet tonight, waiting for you to shut your eyes. I know where you live and or I will find you. So just listen to the story.
Mr. Black's audio animation. By Stereo Stages.
You know, I think we're all gonna get along really, really good. Like really good. The Night I Was Followed by Evil. Submitted by Jacob Livingston. This happened to me when I was 14 years old while walking home from a friend's house one night in the middle of the summer.
Bye, Jake!
School was out, and for that reason, I may have stayed out a bit longer than I was supposed to. By the time I left my buddy's house, the sky was pitch black, but I had walked home from his place several times before, so I thought that night would be no different, and nothing unusual happened for the first few blocks of my journey. Then suddenly, as my shoes scuffed against the concrete sidewalk, I began to hear the faint sound of someone whistling, echoing from a distance behind me.
Hello?
I swiftly spun around to see if anyone was there, but was only met with the sight of a dimly lit, deserted street.
Hello? Hello.
I turned back around and continued to make my way home, telling myself it was nothing. Probably just the wind filtering through the leaves of the oak trees that lined the street. I quietly chuckled to myself for being scared of the dark and felt silly until I heard it again. This time it sounded much closer than it did before. I quickly spun around again and saw what appeared to be someone bending over into the passenger side of a car that was parked on the opposite side of the road. I remember thinking I hadn't noticed the vehicle before, but I told myself through sheer fear-kissed optimism that I probably just hadn't been paying attention. It just simply looked like the person was getting something out of their car.
Christ.
The whistling had stopped, so I wasn't even sure it was them, and even if it was them, whistling isn't much of a crime. I tried to think nothing of it and keep walking, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't significantly pick up my pace after that. I made it roughly 40 yards down the sidewalk when I heard the eerie sound of whistling start up again.
The hell?
I immediately stopped in my tracks and looked around, but this time I didn't see a thing, and the whistling had vanished again.
Jesus, man.
Something in the air just felt off. At this point, I felt the hot flush of danger wash over my senses as my eyes widened into a dry panic. I just couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I started walking even faster down the road towards my house, turning back to look over my shoulder as often as comfortably possible, but never slowing my pace. As I approached a stretch of road that led to my neighborhood, I could feel my heart racing in my chest. This particular section of road was completely absent of any streetlights. A dark void that stood between me and my destination. A sea of black that I had to cross. But moments after I entered the lightless area, I heard the thudding sound of footsteps striking the sidewalk mere yards behind me, coupled with the return of the taunting whistling from before. At this point, I knew I was being followed, and I didn't know what to do. Out of fear, I shot around, still walking backwards, and desperately yelled out,
Who are you? Why are you following me?
No response. The sound of footsteps and whistling had stopped again. The night was as still as a grave. Suddenly, from a few feet away from me, a beam of light shot out of the darkness and hit me directly in the face like a cold brick.
Ah! Hey! That's bright!
I was being blinded by a powerful flashlight.
Stop it!
Without warning, the other footsteps shuffled quickly and headed straight towards me. I made a break for it, blindly running as fast as my legs would allow me to, just trying to maintain the feeling of running on concrete because my eyes hadn't readjusted to the darkness yet. All I could see was black and pulsating blue in my bright bleached vision, but the sound of the haunting whistling that followed me spurred me forward. There were no cell phones back in these days, so all I could do was run for my life and pray that I'd reach my parents' house in time to call the cops and survive my encounter with the evident psychopath that was stalking me like a hunter. My vision dehazed and began to return. The whistling person was still aiming the flashlight at the back of my head, so I couldn't turn around to judge the distance between me and them. I must have been about 300 yards from my neighborhood when a sudden sharp pain began to pinch my sides with every stride I made. It was slowing me down. I think I must have been holding my breath for extended periods of time throughout the chase. I knew I would collapse before I reached my front door if I kept this up, so I tried to pace my breath. I could still hear the heavy footsteps and sadistic whistling following a short distance behind me, but thankfully there was a little more length between myself and them now. There was a curve in the road up ahead where I'd be able to avoid my pursuer's flashlight beam because of a barrier of tall evergreen holly bushes that lined the sidewalk. As soon as I got to the hollies, I quickly ducked in between them. The sharp, thorny edges of the leaves jagged into my skin all over my body. But I fought back the urge to cry out as I ducked down and got as low to the ground as I could. As I hid there in the darker darkness of the evergreens, I could see a large figure emerge from around the curve. It appeared to be a tall, well-built man. The flashlight in his hand was off and he was walking much slower than he was before, as if he knew I had stopped running and was now hiding somewhere nearby. He slowed to a stop only a few feet from where I was hiding and began to scan the area with his flashlight. It was like a scene straight out of a horror movie. A part of me thought that I must be dreaming and that none of it was real, but there I was, face down in the dirt, cowering from a deranged, whistling maniac that was going to do God knows what to me when he found me. After a few minutes of aiming his flashlight in every direction but the spot I was hiding, the man turned around and started walking back the way he came, pointing the flashlight directly at the barrier of holly bushes on the opposite side of the street. I waited until he was completely out of sight, quietly crawled out from under the bushes, and booked it the rest of the way home. After 5 minutes or so, I could see the bulb on my front porch shining a guiding light in my direction. Relief washed over me. I was going to kiss the other side of that door. I mean, what a sight. My house was less than 40 yards away, so I slowed down to catch my breath. But all hope and security faded away as the horrifying sound of a raspy voice coming from directly behind me whispered, "I found you." My skin leapt off the rest of my body as I looked behind me. The man was standing under a flickering streetlight. He was wearing a dark red shirt and black pants. He had what appeared to be a tattoo sleeve running down his right arm. I ran faster than I ever have in my entire life. I could hear the sound of his thudding footsteps closing in behind me. He was full on sprinting after me now. I bolted down my driveway screaming for my parents.
Mom! Dad!
It was about 1 a.m. and my parents were definitely asleep, but I didn't care. Halfway down the gravel driveway, I quickly glanced behind me. The man had stopped at my driveway's entrance, but I didn't stop until I hit the front door and burst in.
Mom! Dad! Help me! After me!
I fumbled through the hall, knocking things over, and fell into my parents' bedroom, startling them awake. In a state of hysterics, I told them everything. My dad jumped out of bed and grabbed his shotgun from the closet. He told my mother and I to stay inside and call the police. As soon as he exited the house, we immediately ran to the window and peeked through the blinds. While my mom called the cops, we watched my dad pace up and down our driveway, holding the 12 gauge, cocked and ready to blast anything that moved. My mother and I were silent as we waited for help to arrive. After my father spent about 20 minutes walking around the outside of our house and scanning the woods behind our property, a sheriff's car turned into our driveway. My dad greeted it in the yard, shotgun in hand. After a couple of minutes, my dad and 2 deputies came inside. I repeated my story to the police and gave them a good description of what the guy looked like. One of the cops asked me where I first spotted the guy. I told him it looked like he was getting something out of a car, and I told the cop the name of the road. Before they left, they told us to keep our doors locked and that we would hear from them again shortly. At around 2:30 a.m., we still hadn't heard anything. My mom said she was tired of waiting and hypothesized that it was probably just some drunk homeless guy who'd spend the night in jail and learn his lesson. Moments later, she kissed my forehead and went to bed. Soon after that, my dad told me to go try and get some sleep as well. He assured me that he would be staying awake until daylight in case the guy returned. I did as my father asked, but there was no way that I would have been able to sleep after what happened, so I just laid there and stared out my window, waiting for daylight. I must have drifted off slightly when I heard a knock at the door. I jumped up and crept over to my bedroom door where I could hear what was happening. My dad answered the door, and it was the cops again. I think it was around 4:30 a.m. at this point. The officer introduced himself as a detective and told my dad that they would like me to come out and identify a suspect they had arrested. Before my dad could call out for me, I was already standing beside him. The cop asked me if I would walk with him out to his patrol car to see if I recognized the man he had arrested. I agreed as long as my dad could walk with me, which obviously he did. When we walked outside, there were at least 6 cars parked in our driveway. Lights on, no sirens. I saw multiple deputies standing around the patrol car we were walking towards. The detective instructed the deputies to take the handcuffed suspect out of the car, and when they did, they shined a bright flashlight in his face. Kind of ironic thinking back on it now. The guy stumbled at first, but the cops finally stood him up straight. To my disbelief, I could now see what I thought was a red shirt was actually a white shirt covered in blood. And what I thought was a tattoo going down his right arm was really just deep, long, fresh scratch marks digging into his flesh. As I stood there, utterly speechless and confused, the detective asked me if this was the man I saw. I nodded yes. It most certainly was. The detective thanked me and walked my dad and I back to our house. He told me I had nothing to worry about anymore and asked my dad if he could have a word with him before he left. My dad obliged and motioned for me to go back to my room. I walked to the hall out of sight, but I stayed within listening distance. I was perfectly quiet as the detective told my dad what they found.
After the deputies left your house, they waited for another unit to come. I was in that unit, and we located the car that your son was talking about. We spotted what looked like bloody footprints leading from the car to the back of the house the car was parked in front of. When we walked around the back of the house, the back door had been smashed in. Then when we entered the house, we found this guy sleeping in one of the beds. This guy had forced his way into the home and brutally murdered everyone inside. You know, I don't know how to say this, but he was cuddled up with the headless bodies of the whole family. 4 people, butchered and mutilated, among with other details that you wouldn't want to know. I gotta tell you, I ain't never seen anything like it.
Oh my God! Pardon me, officer. I think I need to sit down. This is just... My son saw this? My son could have been...
Hold on a second. That's not all. After we arrested the man, we searched the car. In the passenger side of the floorboard were the 4 severed heads of the victims. He had them in a burlap sack, and apparently, they've been in there for a few days.
Oh, God. Jesus Christ. What kind of person would do that?
I don't know. I'm sorry this happened to you, but this is what your son witnessed. We're probably gonna need him to go to court. But as for tonight, consider yourself safe. We got him, so you guys need to try to get some sleep.
After that, I just remember Dad being in the hallway hugging me as he sobbed. I was in shock. None of the details sank in for days. And my mother was never the same after that night. She was friends with the mother that was in that house, and 2 young kids were among the victims. Without a doubt, I wouldn't have survived if that psychopath had caught me. I consider myself very lucky to be alive, and I replay the events from that night over and over in my mind, multiple times a day some days. I testified in court, and the defense lawyer copped an insanity plea which the judge and the jury bought hook, line, and sinker. He escaped death row, but he'll never see the sun again, and I never saw the psycho's face during the whole case. He didn't attend his own trial. The judge had to ban him for disrupting court proceedings. He wouldn't stop whistling. After he was sentenced, my family and I never spoke about that night again. At least not in too much detail. But seeing my dad's truck outside my friend's house whenever he would come pick me up was a constant reminder. This experience is something I will never forget. My mind has never fully recovered from the PTSD or whatever. Sometimes when I lie awake at night, unable to sleep, I swear I can hear someone far off in the darkness whistling.
We are coming for you. 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 We are coming. We are coming. We are coming for you.